Well, we're back, and I'm really excited about this next segment of God's Word that we have the privilege of studying. And we're going to be considering the wisdom literature of the Bible. Job, some of the Psalms are wisdom Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. This is wisdom literature, and we're going to be looking at this material next. Wisdom has the idea of success. Do you want to be successful? Do you want to be a successful student, a successful worker, successful in your family? I don't think there's anybody who doesn't want to be successful. And wisdom has the key, wisdom literature has the key to success. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, which not too many people read or study, we find the key to success. And here it is in Ecclesiastes 10:10. It says, wisdom has the advantage of giving success. In other words, if you want success in life, what you need to be successful is wisdom. Wisdom is the key to success. And so as we study the wisdom books, we're going to learn to be successful people. And here's a few examples of what the wisdom books teach us. The question of suffering. Why does God allow good people to suffer? Well, that's a question we can relate to tonight as we study the book of Job. Suffering, how to cope with it, how to understand it. And then, what place should worship have in my life? We find that in the book of Psalms. Psalms teach us about worship and about praise. And then, how can I be wise and successful? Well, the book of Proverbs is all about wisdom and success and how to avoid the unnecessary complications that sin brings into a person's life. How do I cope with life's frustrations? That's what Ecclesiastes is all about, living with the frustrations that we inevitably encounter in daily life. And then what does God say about sex and about marriage? Well, that's the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon. And it's about marriage and the physical and intimate aspect of marriage. So the wisdom books have a lot to teach us about how to be successful. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce you to the wisdom books. The fundamental lesson of the wisdom writers is this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you want success, you need wisdom. But what is the first lesson on wisdom? The fear of the Lord. But when you think about the fear of the Lord, many people are puzzled by that. They wonder, should they be afraid of God in the sense that you might be afraid of some disaster or some scary situation? Is that what God intends when we find in the Bible to fear the Lord? Well, let me introduce the concept of parallelism in the Hebrew poetry. Parallelism is the key to understanding Hebrew poetry. Now, railroad tracks are parallel to each other. The two tracks, one on one side, one on the other, those are in parallel relationship. And we also find this to be true in Hebrew poetry. Two lines of Hebrew poetry are in parallel relationship. This is the major characteristic of Hebrew poetry. As we look at the parallel relationship between two lines that say the same thing in different words, it provides insight into what a particular concept may mean. Here's how it works. Proverbs 2 verse 5. If you seek her, that is wisdom, as silver, then you'll discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. Notice the two lines, the fear of the Lord, the knowledge of God. Now those two lines are in parallel relationship. They're saying the same thing with different words. And from that relationship of these two lines, we can discern that the fear of the Lord involves a knowledge of God. So knowing God is the first step to coming to have this fear of the Lord. Let's look at another one. Job 28:28. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, to depart from evil is understanding. Notice the parallelism between the fear of the Lord and to depart from evil. In other words, the fear of the Lord is to depart from evil. If you're not departing from evil, you're not fearing the Lord. Those are two different ways of saying the same thing. The fear of the Lord is to depart from evil. Fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To depart from evil is understanding. Two ways of saying the same thing. Again, in Proverbs 16, verse 6, by the fear of the Lord, one keeps away from evil. So the fear of the Lord means to turn away from evil. Practicing the fear of the Lord means I'm going to turn away from evil rather than pursuing evil. If I'm pursuing evil, I'm not fearing the Lord. If I'm turning away from evil, I am fearing the Lord. Psalm 111, verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those who do his commandments. Notice the relationship between the fear of the Lord and doing his commandments. How do you fear the Lord? By doing his commandments. It's not just so much an attitude, it's an action. It's an action-oriented response to God. The fear of the Lord is doing his commandments. And then Psalm 8, verse 13, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Do you hate what God hates, or do you love what God hates? Those who fear the Lord share God's attitude toward evil. You know, sometimes we find ourselves being entertained by evil or laughing at evil. But the fear of the Lord means I'm going to have God's attitude toward evil. I'm going to share his hatred of that which displeases him. Well, these give us a sense for what this fear of the Lord is all about. James Houston writes, the fear of the Lord expresses the knowledge of the will of God in that it entails both an awareness of it and a wholehearted response to it. I like that, a wholehearted response to it. That's what the fear of the Lord is all about. It recognizes the will of God, and it embraces it with a wholehearted response. Spurgeon said, wisdom is the practical and successful use of knowledge. To know is not to be wise, but to know how to use knowledge is to have wisdom. So many people know a lot, but they aren't very effective in the application of what they know. They do some stupid things. But to know how to use your knowledge, that's wisdom. Charles Spurgeon. And I summarize it in a briefer form. Wisdom is the practical and successful application of God's truth to life's experiences. It's the practical application of God's truth that we find in the Scripture, God's truth to life experiences. The neat thing about wisdom is that we can all have it. We can all have it by practicing the fear of the Lord. You don't have to be old and gray to be wise. You can be young and be wise because you're practicing the truth of God's Word. You've embraced it. You're wholeheartedly responding to it. And you're turning away from evil. You're seeking to do what pleases the Lord. And it will bring blessing to your life. What benefits does wisdom have? Ecclesiastes 8, verse 12. It'll be well with those who fear the Lord. And throughout Proverbs and the wisdom books, we find the blessing that comes as a result of wise behavior. Wisdom has benefits. It pays benefits. You're going to avoid a lot of complications in life simply by following the wise course of action. You're going to steer away from a lot of sinful and devastating circumstances by following wisdom. And it all begins with the fear of the Lord. So we'll be looking at the lessons of wisdom as we study the wisdom books. But tonight we're in the book of Job, and so we want to focus our attention on this book, Job, his tragedy and his triumph. Why does God allow those who love and serve him to suffer? Boy, this is a question that I've asked, you've probably asked, most people ask at some time in their lives. Why does God allow tragedy to come into the lives of those who love and serve him? It's a question, and you probably have a story in your own life, and you wonder, why did God allow this automobile accident? Why did God allow this death? Why did God allow me to lose my job or to experience a breakup in a relationship? And we could all probably tell a story, and we wonder why. Why does God allow these things when we have committed ourselves to loving and serving him, and yet he allows these things to come into our lives? Well, as we look at the book of Job, we ask a lot of questions. What are the reasons for our suffering? How should we respond as Christians to suffering? And most importantly, Is it possible to keep on believing that God is good and that He loves us in the midst of our trials? Is it possible to keep faith in the midst of our trials? These are questions we ask when suffering comes, and these are questions the book of Job can help us to deal with. Many people look at the book of Job as a classic study of the problem of suffering, and certainly it is a classic study. But as we delve deeper into the book, we discover that it really is a book that deals with the problem of faith and doubt. And suffering is merely the context in which to wrestle with this problem of faith and doubt. Faith. How can we go on believing God when He doesn't seem to be there, when He doesn't seem to care? Will doubt take over because God doesn't seem to be answering our prayers? God doesn't seem to be protecting us and looking after us. So the ultimate bottom line, I think, in our study of this book is how to keep on believing in God when He doesn't seem to be there and He doesn't seem to care. G.K. Chesterton wrote, "The Iliad is great because all life is a battle. The Odyssey because all life is a journey. And the book of Job because all life is a riddle." And there's lots of puzzling things in life. All life is a riddle. We wonder why. And the book of Job gives us a context in which we can wrestle with that question. Let's get a look at the basic facts on this book of Job. The book is anonymous, but the Talmud, this is the Jewish tradition, attributes it to Moses. There doesn't seem to be any internal evidence that would support Mosaic authorship, but it's always a possibility. This was the Jewish tradition. As to the date of writing, there's wide divergence of opinion on when the book was written. Some say in the patriarchal age, before Moses. Some say during the reign of Solomon, who was so noted for his wisdom literature. Others say in the time of Manasseh or Jeremiah, or even the Babylonian exile. A number of conservatives will date the book during the reign of Solomon, who is noted for his literary pursuits. And as a wise man, he might have recognized that the book of Job certainly had something to add to this pursuit of wisdom. Under historical setting, the internal evidence suggests that the patriarchal age, the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, provides the historical setting for the book. This would account for Job's patriarchal family clan organization, the fact that he was sacrificing for his family, his longevity, 140 years plus. This would also account for the lack of any reference to Israel in the book. No reference to Israel, no reference to the Exodus, no reference to Moses or his law. The events of the book reflect a non-Hebraic background, a background that seems to be quite distinct from Israel and their background. Job lived in the district of Uz, which is located in northern Arabia, so quite a ways from the land of Israel. Many believe that Job was written to consider the problem, why do the righteous suffer? While the problem of suffering certainly provides the historical context, the historical setting for the book, the author presents even more significant issue, the problem of faith and doubt. Faith and doubt is really what is the issue here as we study the book of Job. The book of Job leads the reader to consider, how do you maintain faith in God in the face of such devastating trials? How do you go on believing in God when He doesn't seem to be there, when He seems to be absent, and when He doesn't seem to care? The book of Job is intended to demonstrate that it is possible, and Job gives us that example. It is possible to go on believing, as Job did, even in a time of trial. The theme of the book, keeping faith in times of trial. How do you do in times of trial? How do you do when bad news comes your way? How do you respond when you experience a crisis? Do you go on believing God, or do you doubt His existence and turn away from Him? Job presents an example of a man who went through a devastating trial, but in the midst of it, he blessed the Lord. As we look at the book, we find it begins in chapters 1 and 2 with historical narrative. It concludes in chapter 42 with historical narrative. But the main part of the book, chapters 3 through 42:6, are all poetry. And so we see that this is a book that reflects a different kind of form. It's not written as historical narrative. It's written in a poetic way. And so the author put this together in a poetic way. So it's a different kind of literature. It's still true. It still all happened, but it's written in a poetic literature, which would, for the ancient Israelite, enable them to remember it better and to remember the poetry and use the poetry as a memory device. So the book begins with the account of Job's situation. And Job's situation is described here. We read, "There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil." What does this verse tell us about Job's character? Well, it tells us that Job was a good man. He was blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. This verse is the key to our interpretation of Job's experience. And not only is it said here by the author at the beginning of the book, it is said twice by the Lord. In chapter 1, verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered Job? There's no one like him on earth, blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil." And then again in chapter 2, verse 3, once again the Lord describes Job as blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. Some people say that Job is suffering because of something that God is trying to deal with, maybe a sin that Job has committed. But that certainly goes against the clear statement of verse 1, that Job was a good man with a blameless character, and this is the key to really understanding Job's experience. God wasn't punishing Job or disciplining him for something he had done, as we'll see. So Job was enjoying life. Life was good, and he was enjoying a good life and blessing from the Lord. But then one day Satan raises the question with, God raises a question with Satan about Job. And God points out Job's character, and Satan responds and says, "Job is being good because you're being good to him." This is Satan's view concerning Job. Job is merely being good because it pays to be good. Job is being good because he is getting benefits from his relationship with God. And so on the basis of that, there's a challenge. God says, well, Satan, I'll let you take away those benefits, take away those blessings, take away all those things I provided for Job, and we'll see. We'll see if his faith is genuine. We'll see if he continues to believe me and follow me, or whether he turns away. So Job is going to be a test case of genuine faithfulness and love for God. Chapter 1, verse 13, we see the first assault on Job. 4 staggering blows filled Job's world with sorrow. And we read of these in chapter 1, verse 14. "A messenger came to Job, saying, The oxen were plowing, the donkeys were feeding, and the Sabines attacked and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God," perhaps lightning, "fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came. "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a wind came, crossed the wilderness, and struck the house. It fell on the young people, and they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you." 4 staggering blows filled Job's world with sorrow. Whew. How would you respond in such a situation like this? Well, Job knew a great truth. I think he knew and understood the truth that is found in Ecclesiastes 7, verse 13. A book that probably hadn't even been written yet, but Job understood this truth. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 13, "Consider the work of God, who is able to straighten what he has bent. In the day of prosperity, be happy. But in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other." Job had experienced the days of prosperity, and now he was going through a day of adversity. But he recognized that God was sovereign over both of those days. God was sovereign over the day of prosperity. He was sovereign over the day of adversity. And how did Job respond? Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave. That was the day of prosperity. And the Lord has taken away. That's the day of adversity. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. So what has Job proven by his response to this tragedy? Job has proven that Satan's theory is wrong, that Job is only being good because God is being good to him. Job has proved that Satan was wrong in his evaluation of Job's character, and that Job really loves God because of who God is, not just because of the benefits that he is getting from God. Satan is not convinced that Job is a man of good character. And so once again, he is there before God, and the Lord points out Job. And he points to him and said, consider my servant Job. There's no one like him on the earth, blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. He still holds fast to his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Notice the without cause. There was nothing in Job's character that led God to chasten or discipline him in this way. But Satan is still not convinced. And so he says, skin for skin. All a man has he will give for his life. What he's saying there is that Job is maintaining his piety because he doesn't want to get hurt further. He doesn't want to have any damage come to his own person. Just as a child will put out their hand and lose some skin when they fall down, lose the skin on the hand to save some skin on their nose, so Job is being good because he doesn't want to lose his physical health. He doesn't want to suffer any further loss. Well, Job's integrity is still being questioned by Satan, and so God allows Satan to take away Job's health. And he says, only thing, spare his life. You can't kill him, but you can take away his health. And Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Very painful situation that Job found himself in this second assault by Satan. Medical opinion isn't unanimous in its diagnosis of Job's disease. But let's take a look at the symptoms. We see the first symptom in inflamed eruptions on the skin, these boils, chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. Chapter 7 mentions maggots and open flesh wounds. So the flesh was deteriorating, maggots were feeding on the flesh, a horrible situation. Chapter 7, verse 14, we see he has a fever and terrible nightmares in the midst of his fever. He's got bad breath, chapter 19, verse 17. He's got pain in his bones, indicates real deep sickness, and a blackening of the skin. Whatever Job has, it wasn't pleasant. He was suffering a great deal in his situation. But how did Job respond? He didn't curse God. And when his wife said, why don't you go ahead and curse God and then he'll kill you and your suffering will be over, he was very tender with her and said, honey, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Notice, guys, he didn't call her a foolish woman. He says, honey, you're speaking out of character. It's not like you to talk like that. You're speaking out of character. You're speaking like a foolish woman. And then he instructs her, shall we accept adversity from God? Shall we accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin. Job didn't sin. Well, Job was suffering, and fortunately, in his suffering, he had some friends who came to see him. Chapter 3, Job's friends came. Now, as we continue on our study, we're going to have a little lower opinion of Job's friends. But before we get there, remember that Job's friends came to him. They came, said, Job, there's probably a best-selling book in your experience, and certainly it became part of the Bible. But you know, Job's friends came, and there's no substitute for being there when somebody's going through a terrible time of suffering. and you are training for church ministry, for pastoral ministry, for Christian leadership, and people in your care will experience a loss. They'll experience a death of a loved one. They'll experience personal loss, their own health, and there's nothing more important for you than to simply be there. You don't have to come up with a big explanation of why this has happened, or just be there. Just be there and hold their hand and pray with them and tell them you love them. And there's a special ministry of pastoral presence that there's no substitute for. Just an aside, I remember when my 15-year-old brother was killed in an automobile accident, and I remember the people that came to our home and visited us. You know, I don't have any recollection of what they said, but I remember that they came. I remember the pastor that came. I remember my dad's best friend who came from Montana. He came to be with my dad there in Eugene, my mom and dad. People came because they cared. And when you are going through, when your parishioner is going through a difficult time, the best thing for you is to be there and just to tell them that you care and to weep with those who are weeping and to be there. Well, that's just a word on pastoral ministry. Nothing is more important than simply being there. Your words will be forgotten, but your presence will not be forgotten. Well, Job's friends, they were silent for 7 days. That's a good thing. They waited for Job to speak, and they were silent for 7 days, just being there. But then as they began to wrestle with this issue, all of Job's friends had the same view on suffering. And here's their thesis. All suffering is punishment for sin. Job is suffering. Their conclusion, Job is a sinner. It's logical, isn't it? If all suffering is punishment for sin, and Job is suffering, the logical conclusion is that Job is a sinner. Where's the fallacy in this little, in the logic of this statement? You see it? Do you see the fallacy there? Is all suffering punishment for sin? You know, there's some suffering that comes because we're followers of Jesus. It's not punishment for sin. There's some suffering that people go through because of what other people have done. That's not punishment for sin. You see, they had a misguided opinion that said all suffering is punishment for sin. Therefore, since Job is suffering, he must be a sinner. That was their viewpoint. And we'll evaluate that as we continue on. Job did pretty well. He blessed the Lord. He instructed his wife. His friends came and sat with him 7 days. And then chapter 3, verse 1, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Job cursed the day of his birth, and we wonder what has happened from chapter 1, verse 20, where he blessed the Lord, to chapter 3, verse 1, where he curses the day of his birth. What's happened to Job? I'm going to suggest that the passing of time has ingrained the sense of loss and the severity of the pain and the total injustice of it all. And Job is coming to grips now with the fact that his children aren't going to come back. His health has been ruined. He's lost his property. He's lost his servants. He's lost virtually everything but his life. And he is wrestling with his own life and why his life should go on. And so he curses the day. Notice he doesn't curse God. He curses the day of his birth. Staten said he cursed God. He didn't curse God. He cursed the day of his birth. And then he questions, why did I not die at birth? If God had been good, he would have just let me die at birth. He knew what was going to happen. He could have spared me all that by letting me die as a child. And then he questions, why must my life continue? Why, verse 20, why is light given to him who suffers, and life to the one who's bitter of soul? Those who long for death, but there is none, who dig for it more than hidden treasures. You know, there are people who are in our nursing homes and hospitals who long to go to be with Jesus. They know they're going to go to heaven. They're suffering here on this earth, and they're looking forward to that promotion to heaven. But their life goes on. And if you don't believe in the sanctity of life, you're going to vote for euthanasia. You're going to vote for giving these people morphine to kill them because it seems like it's just terrible to let them suffer like this. So you have to have a strong view of the sanctity of life and that only God can end a life. Otherwise, you end up with euthanasia. Job is struggling. He's struggling with, he's suicidal. He's not going to end his life, but he certainly wants to. And you're going to interact with people that are at this point. Why didn't I die? Why must my life continue? And your pastoral presence, you're not going to answer all their questions, but you can come alongside them in their time of need. Well, we've got Job's three friends, and they all have an opinion about why Job is going through what he is going through. Let's introduce these three friends of Job. And the first is Eliphaz, and we meet him in chapter 4. Eliphaz the mystic. Eliphaz bases his interpretation on what Job is going through on his own personal experience, a mystical vision. And so he says, remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? What's he saying to Job? He's saying, Job, you're not innocent. Who perished being innocent? And he says, those who sow trouble harvest it, verse 8. In other words, Job, this comes as a consequence of your sin. You've been sowing trouble. You've been doing wrong. And now God's punishing you for it. Suffering results from sin. God is punishing you for your sin. The basis for his opinion is his mystical night vision. He says in verse 12, a word came to me stealthily, that is kind of secretly, and my ear received a whisper of it. Amid disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night, when sleep falls upon men, dread came upon me and trembling, and made all my bones shake. A spirit passed by my face. The hair of my flesh bristled up. It stood still. I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence, and then I heard a voice. And here's what the voice said. Can mankind be just before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? Well, obvious answer, no. None of us are perfect. None of us are perfectly pure except through Christ. Well, on that basis, he concludes that Job, like all people, has sinned. And now he's paying the penalty for his sin. Those who sow trouble harvest it. Well, that's Eliphaz's opinion. Job is getting what he deserved. In chapter 8, we read about Bildad, the traditionalist. And in chapter 8, we find that Bildad believes in tradition and consensus of opinion. Notice how he appeals in chapter 8. Please inquire of past generations and consider the things searched out by the fathers. We're only of yesterday and know nothing. But he's saying, let's go back and see what the other folks have said in the past. And he argues on the basis of tradition and consensus of opinion that the wicked are destroyed, not the righteous. Job, all those folks in the past will testify to the fact that the wicked are punished, not the righteous. If the wicked are punished and not the righteous, and you're suffering, it must be because you're wicked. That's his conclusion. Bildad, the traditionalist. And then there's Zophar. Zophar is the rationalist. We meet him in chapter 11. Zophar says, shall a multitude of words go unanswered, and a talkative man be acquitted? Shall your boast silence men? Shall you scoff and none rebuke? You've said my teaching is pure, I am innocent in your eyes. Know that God forgets part of your iniquity. What's he saying? He's saying, you know, you're only getting half of what you deserve, Job. You should be punished more. He's a theologian, though, kind of a rationalistic theologian. And notice what he asks about God. He says, can you discover the depths of God? Can you discover the limits of the Almighty? They are as high as heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? In other words, he's saying, you know, nobody can really understand God. Nobody can understand why God is doing this to you, Job. But based on his rationalism, he says God is dealing with you in a way you deserve. In fact, you're only getting half of what you deserve. You deserve more punishment than what you're receiving. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, Job's friends, so to speak. But they all have this opinion that all suffering is punishment for sin. Job is suffering, therefore Job must be a sinner. They all share this thesis, this understanding. And they all speak in this first round, and then there's a second round, and once again, each of them speaks, Eliphaz, and as they speak in this second round, they're more insistent on the idea that Job is a sinner and that he is getting what he deserves. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar all speak a second time. And then we have a third round, and with this third round, Zophar stops speaking. We only have Eliphaz and Bildad speaking, and they're basically pointing the finger at Job and saying, Job, you've sinned. And Job says, yes, I know I'm a sinner, but not in any way that would have resulted in my suffering to the extent that I've gone through it in these recent weeks. They all insist that Job is a sinner and he's getting what he deserves. But now there's the fourth person that speaks up, and this is Elihu. He's a young man. Kind of like to identify myself with Elihu. And Elihu is different. He has a broader perspective on suffering than Job's three friends. He doesn't relate all suffering to sin. He has a broader perspective. And Elihu is going to raise some questions that causes Job to think, who is a teacher like God? God may be teaching you something, Job. Surely there's a lesson in this for you. So his encouragement to Job is, think about what God is trying to teach you through this experience. Chapter 36, verse 22. Behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? That's 36, verse 22. In other words, this isn't because you've sinned, Job, but God is taking you through this experience to teach you something that you wouldn't learn otherwise and apart from such a difficult experience. You know, Elihu gives us a little different perspective on Job's suffering, and I like it. Elihu says, you know, you can't figure out if there's some sin that God is dealing with, but you can listen to the lesson that God may be teaching you through this experience. Learn from it, Job. Learn from what God is taking you through. We come to chapter 38, and it's here that God himself speaks. Chapters 38 through 41, we have the Creator speaking. And God reveals himself to Job. And here we see that God is speaking as the Creator. What do you know, Job, about my creative work and my sovereign power? Job has kind of had a tendency through this process of suffering to begin to complain about God and say that God really isn't being fair with him in allowing this suffering to come into his life. And so in order to counter that, God asked Job some questions. And so chapter 38, he says, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth, Job? Where were you when I created all these things and established them? Oh, where were you when I made the sea? Have you ever walked in the recesses of the deep? Have you ever commanded the dawn and made the day arise? He's asking questions of Job about creation. Of course, Job isn't able to answer these. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Well, we know that light doesn't have a box where it lives or dwells, but this is poetry, and it's intended to ask questions that Job can't answer. Job, do you know anything about light or darkness or how I create that? Obviously, Job doesn't. What the Lord is doing here is trying to confront Job with his own ignorance and his own impotence in comparison to the God of creation. I like in chapter 38, verse 31, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? I enjoy looking at the night sky and seeing the Pleiades, the seven sisters, and seeing Orion in the winter sky with Orion's belt and sword. And these constellations are mentioned here in Job 38. And obviously, Job can't control the constellations. But what is God doing? God's saying, Job, recognize who I am. I'm the Creator. I'm the one who created you and created all things. And you can't expect to understand all my workings. Much less can you understand my sovereignty over your life. These questions are designed to confront Job with his own ignorance of God's creative order. The interesting thing in God's talking to Job is that he never condemns Job for a hidden sin. Now, if Job's friends are right, there must be something that God is dealing with. But God never mentions a hidden sin. God never rebukes Job for doing something wrong or saying, this was the reason you suffered because of this sin. What does God say about Job's suffering? Surprise. God doesn't even mention it. God doesn't even mention the problem of suffering. Rather, Job is directed to God's greatness and his power. God never condemns Job, but what God seeks to do is remind Job of who he is. And you know, eventually, Job's questions about God and why he is suffering dissipate. They evaporate when once again he has a vision and an understanding and appreciation of the greatness of God. Job's had all these questions, but now that God has spoken, Job realizes that he really has no questions at all because he has met God. As we come to chapter 42, the end of the book, we find that Job is finally satisfied, not because he's gotten an answer to his question. Job is satisfied because he's met God. Through his trial, Job has met God. He's seen God in a new way. And suffering and trials give us a new experience with God. If you're going through a time of suffering or a time of trial and not seeing the lesson in it, not getting to know God better through that experience, then you're really missing out on the wonderful thing that God has for you in the midst of a trial. In chapter 42, verses 7 through 17, we see that Job's friends are indicted and condemned for their wrong views. Pretty clear that Job's friends were off and wrong on this. And Job is restored, and his fortunes are restored. And he has a whole nother family, more children. We see he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And it said that his daughters were the most beautiful in the land. So Job was blessed in the end as God restored his fortunes and restored his family. The curtains were pulled back so that we could see the background of Job's experience and why he was suffering, because there was this controversy going on between God and Satan over Job's righteousness and whether it was genuine or whether he was just being good because God was being good to him. But, you know, Job never knew the reason for his suffering. He never knew the conflict that was going on behind the scenes. Only us, as the readers of the story, have that information and background. But there are some explanations for suffering we can find in Scripture. And if we go to the Word of God, we find that there is suffering as divine punishment for sin. And we see examples of that in the fall of humanity in Genesis chapter 3, and Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5, and Peter mentions it as well, and John the Apostle in 1 John 5 verse 14. So there is punishment for sin. There is consequences of misbehavior. God holds his people accountable. Some suffering is disciplinary or corrective, and we find in Hebrews chapter 12 that whom the Lord loves, he chastens, he disciplines. And if you're not being chastened by the Lord, it would indicate that you're not one of his children, because whom he loves, he chastens. Some discipline is some suffering is for punishment, but that's for the unbeliever. But for believers, there is corrective discipline. And God does that so he can cause us to be more holy and sanctified and to turn to him in the midst of our trials. Some suffering results from persecution, and Jesus promised that followers of Jesus would suffer. The world would hate us because the world hates Jesus, and Paul warned of this as well. And so there are situations in which believers are persecuted and suffer because of that. And then there's suffering that has a spiritual purpose. Paul mentions the thorn in the flesh. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7, he mentions that 3 times he prayed to be relieved from this thorn in the flesh, and God didn't answer the prayer in the way that Paul wanted. God said that he would grow, and that he would experience God's grace through this suffering. So suffering may have a spiritual purpose. And then there may be a divine purpose in suffering, like Job had, a purpose for which we will never know and understand, never be known to the one enduring the trial. And so there's some situations in which we will never know why we're going through a trial or a sense of loss. The fact is, we don't need to know why we're suffering if we know God, the God who is sovereign over all. We don't need to know why. What we need to do is follow Job's example and bless the Lord. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. That's what Job did when he encountered his trial. He blessed the name of the Lord. I remember when I encountered prostate cancer about 5 years ago, and I remember when the doctor told me that I had cancer. Well, that was a bit of a shock, but as I looked at that, I thought, this is going to be an experience in which I have the opportunity to demonstrate to my family and to my students that my faith is real, that I really do believe and trust God as the sovereign one over my life. I never once asked why God allowed it. Why? There's no answer to that. I got cancer because of the fall, and sin results in sickness, and sickness strikes all people. And so that was what the Lord had for me. But what I did experience was a great experience in learning how to trust God through that experience, through that trial, through that surgery, through my recovery, and to be able to praise Him in the years that have followed. And I am praising the Lord that my cancer was discovered early, and I've had a good recovery. There was a couple that worked for Campus Crusade for Christ, the Grunseths, and Jim and Julie Grunseth. They experienced a great loss in terms of their health. Julie had breast cancer. They had a child with disability. As they were involved in a move, the truck that their property was on, the moving van, caught fire, and everything they owned, portrait albums, photo albums and all, burned up. They lost everything. The cancer that Julie had returned after her surgery, and she eventually died. In the midst of that, they wrote a letter to friends, and here's what they said: "Our hope is not in our circumstances. Our hope is not in our healing." Julie wasn't healed. She died. Our hope is in God alone. And that's really where our hope must be, because our circumstances we can't control. Our healing, that's up to God. But our hope is in the Lord. That's where we place our hope. That's where we place our confidence. Trials are difficult, but they are learning experiences and can draw us close to the Lord. Lech Walesa, he was the leader of Poland's Solidarity movement, and he wrote these words: "When I was young, I pondered God's existence and looked for signs to confirm Him. But here's what he said: my faith did not grow until life grew harder. The more difficult my path became, the closer I came to my faith." As your path grows difficult, allow it to push you on closer to the Lord, and follow the example of Job. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." I trust that by God's grace and by your faith in Him, you will be able to bless Him when the trials come, because they will. And I think reading Job and understanding the message can help prepare us for the trial that is yet around the corner. Not that we have to be pessimistic, but we live on a fallen earth where there is sickness and sorrow and death. And so when those trials come, be prepared for them. Recognize they're part of humanity's experience, and look for the lesson that God has for you, and bless the name of the Lord. May the Lord bless you tonight as you interact with the discussion questions, and I look forward to being together with you again next week. Good night.